The silence of her barren womb echoed louder than any wailing infant ever could, a devastating emptiness that slowly, irrevocably, consumed the last embers of her family's fading hope. She was Ayanna, daughter of the Crow, but her name felt hollow, a mocking whisper against the crushing weight of expectation. Her body, meant to bloom with life, had instead become a withered vine, incapable of bearing the fruit her lineage demanded. It was a curse, a shame etched onto her very being, seen in the downturned glances of the women, the averted eyes of the men, and most agonizingly, the growing distance in her parents' gazes. They, who had once held her with such pride, now saw only the future denied, the ancestral spirits unappeased, the tribal line broken. The council had met, hushed voices carrying on the wind, deliberating her fate as if she were a withered branch to be pruned from the tree. Their decision, delivered with grave faces and hollow pronouncements, landed like a stone in her chest. She was to be traded, a commodity for a desperate bargain, not for furs nor horses nor even vital provisions, but for the chance of a son, a future that she in her tragic inadequacy could never provide. The sun, usually a comforting warmth, now seemed to beat down with a cruel, indifferent heat, illuminating the stark reality of her displacement. The familiar scent of wood smoke and damp earth, once the fragrance of home, now carried the bitter tang of exile. She watched the dust devils dance across the plains, spiraling upwards as if mocking her own uncontrolled descent into nothingness. Each breath was a labor, a shallow gasp against the tightening vice of despair that gripped her heart. The world, once vibrant with the pulse of her people, had receded into a blurry, muted backdrop, leaving her isolated within the confines of her own profound sorrow. Her existence, once defined by the promise of motherhood and the continuity of her bloodline, had been brutally redefined by its absence. She was a vessel found wanting, a broken pot tossed aside, deemed worthless in the grand, unforgiving tapestry of their traditions. This was the moment where her very essence began to unravel, where the vibrant threads of her identity frayed and snapped, leaving her adrift on a desolate sea of uncertainty. The land itself seemed to weep with her, the distant thunder rumbling a lament for the life she had been denied, and the life she was about to lose. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in violent hues of crimson and bruised purple, a reflection of the turmoil raging within Ayanna's heart. She stood, a solitary figure dwarfed by the immensity of the plains, the echoes of her parents' final resolute words still ringing in her ears. A daughter, traded for the possibility of a legacy. The trade was simple, brutal in its efficiency. Her very self for a young mare, fertile and strong, destined to carry the son Ayanna could not. It was a bitter irony, a cutting reminder of her perceived worth. The Crow encampment, once a beacon of warmth and belonging, now stood as a silent monument to her abandonment. Each gust of wind carried the phantom voices of her kin, their judgment a cold hand clutching her spirit. She had wandered directionless for what felt like an eternity, the dust of her homeland clinging to her moccasins, a mournful shroud. Her mind, a whirlwind of betrayal and grief, could not grasp the full horror of her new reality. The world outside the familiar circle of her people was a vast, terrifying unknown, a wilderness as unforgiving as the truth that had severed her from her roots. It was then, amidst the fading light and the rising chill, that he emerged from the twilight haze, a figure on horseback, silent as a predator, his silhouette sharp against the dying light. He was a Kiowa, she knew by the cut of his buckskins, the style of his braids, the way he held himself with an almost predatory stillness. He watched her, his eyes, even from a distance, seeming to pierce through her despair, assessing, calculating. There was no warmth in his gaze, no overt pity, only a quiet, unnerving intensity. He dismounted, movements fluid and economical, his presence a stark contrast to her own shattered composure. "You are the Crow daughter?" His voice was low, a rumble like distant thunder, devoid of inflection. Ayanna nodded, her throat tight, a single defiant tear tracing a path down her dust-streaked cheek. "My name is Kyle," he stated, his eyes lingering on her face for a moment too long. Your parent, they sold you. It was not a question, but a blunt affirmation of her worst fears, a stark mirror reflecting the brutal truth of her situation. She felt a prickle of fear, a primal instinct screaming at her to flee, but where could she go? He was her only tether, however fragile, to an uncertain future. His purpose remained veiled, shrouded in the deepening shadows, leaving her to wonder what strange, convoluted path her life was now forced to follow. The air grew heavy with unspoken questions, with the weight of her fate now inextricably bound to this enigmatic stranger. The journey began before the first blush of dawn, the world still cloaked in the deep, inky black of night. Kyle moved with an unsettling efficiency, his actions deliberate and unhurried, yet filled with an undeniable urgency. Ayanna, still numb from the shock of her displacement, merely followed, her body a vessel carrying a fractured spirit. The horse beneath her, a sturdy pony that seemed as weary as she, plodded steadily onward, its hooves kicking up dust that swirled around them like forgotten ghosts. The landscape was vast, indifferent, stretching endlessly towards a horizon that offered no solace. Each mile that passed further cemented the chasm between her and everything she had ever known. The sun, when it finally clawed its way above the eastern plains, cast long, distorted shadows, making the familiar appear alien, threatening. Kyle spoke little, his words sparse, direct, focused only on the immediate necessities: water, direction, the occasional warning about the treacherous terrain. His silence was a heavy shroud, amplifying the unspoken questions that festered in Ayanna's mind. Why had he come for her? What did he truly intend? Was this an act of strange mercy or a transaction with hidden costs? She stole glances at him when she thought he wouldn't notice, trying to decipher the unreadable lines of his face, the stoic set of his jaw. He was a man forged by the unforgiving land, scarred by experiences she could only imagine. Sometimes a flicker of something she couldn't quite name, perhaps a shadow of weariness, or a hint of a deeper melancholy, would cross his eyes, quickly masked by his customary reserve. They rode through sun-baked grasslands, across rocky riverbeds, and into valleys where the air hung heavy and still. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the rhythmic thud of hooves and the sigh of the wind. Ayanna's thoughts were a tangled mess of fear, resentment, and a burgeoning, desperate curiosity. She knew nothing of this man, this Kiowa scout who had taken possession of her, yet her survival now depended entirely on his whims. There were moments when the vastness of their isolation pressed in, threatening to overwhelm her. The sheer emptiness of the land mirrored the emptiness within her, a barren landscape stretching outward as far as the eye could see, and inward, into the desolate chambers of her own heart. She watched Cale's back, a constant, unyielding presence ahead of her, and wondered if he too carried a hidden burden, a wound as deep and unyielding as her own. The journey was not just a physical displacement, but a profound spiritual one, each step taking her further from who she was, and closer to an unknown, unsettling becoming. Long before the bitter taste of rejection, before the whispered word barren became a brand upon her soul, Ayanna was called Little Willow by her mother. It was a name chosen for her suppleness, her gentle spirit, her youthful grace. She remembered days when the sun felt like a loving hand on her hair, when the laughter of her sisters filled the air like birdsong, and the stories told by the elders woven like colorful threads into the fabric of her dreams. Her earliest memories were of her mother's hands, strong and calloused from work, yet tender as they braided Ayanna's hair, teaching her the songs of their people, imparting the wisdom of generations. There was a time when the future had seemed limitless, vibrant with possibilities. She envisioned her own children, their faces a blend of her own and her beloved, their voices echoing in the teepee, continuing the unbroken line. She played with dolls fashioned from deerskin, mimicking the movements of a nurturing mother, her heart swelling with the innocent certainty of a destiny fulfilled. As she blossomed into a young woman, the expectations grew, unspoken yet omnipresent. Her tribe, like many others, valued fertility above all else. A woman's true worth was often measured by the life she could bring forth. She participated in the rituals, learned the ways of the women, observed the pregnant bellies and the joyful mothers, all the while absorbing the profound importance of their roles. There was pride in it, a sense of belonging to something ancient and powerful. Then came the first whispers, faint as the rustling of dry leaves. The months turned into seasons, the seasons into years, and still, her womb remained empty. Her friends, younger than she, began to carry life within them, their eyes shining with the glow of impending motherhood. Ayanna watched, a silent ache growing in her chest. The communal joy felt increasingly like a personal torment. The gentle inquiries from her mother turned into worried glances, then into desperate pleas to the spirits. The healers offered remedies, their potions bitter, their incantations fervent, but nothing changed the cold, hard truth. The name Little Willow began to feel like a cruel mockery, for a willow was meant to sway, to bend, to root deeply and sprout new life. Her, barren, was a tree without roots, a spirit without offspring. The world that had once seemed boundless, now constricted, shrinking around her like a tightening snare. The memory of that joyful, innocent girl, full of promise, felt like a phantom limb, a part of herself that had been severed long ago, leaving behind only the dull, constant throb of its absence. This was the foundation of her fear, the deep-seated terror that had made her so vulnerable to her parents' ultimate decision. They made camp by a winding river, its waters a murky mirror reflecting the bruised twilight sky. Kale, with a quiet competence, set about building a small fire, the crackle of burning wood a welcome sound in the vast silence. Ayanna watched him, a part of her still wary, another part recognizing the stark necessity of his actions. He was a survivor, moving through the wilderness with an almost primal grace, intimately attuned to its rhythms and demands. For the first time in days, a semblance of routine settled upon them, however fragile. She gathered wood, fetched water, her hands moving mechanically, finding a strange comfort in the simple, repetitive tasks. This was not a life, not yet, but it was existence. He hunted, returning with a rabbit, its warmth a tangible promise of sustenance. As they ate, cooked over the dancing flames, the raw edges of Ayanna's fear began to soften, replaced by a dull ache of resignation. She was no longer a crow woman in any recognizable sense, her identity stripped away, but neither was she entirely lost. She was simply with Kyle. He never pressed her for conversation, never offered empty reassurances. He simply was. His eyes, often distant, sometimes held a quality that she couldn't quite decipher. A deep sadness, perhaps, or a profound weariness. There were moments, fleeting and easily missed, when his guard seemed to drop, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the hardened exterior. Once, as he sharpened his knife, the firelight danced across his face, highlighting an old scar near his temple, a jagged line that spoke of past battles, of a life lived on the dangerous edge. Ayanna found herself wondering about his own story, the path that had led him to this solitary existence, to this unexpected intersection with her own shattered life. The quiet understanding between them grew, not through words, but through shared silence, through the shared vulnerability of their isolated journey. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the slight tensing of his muscles, knowing instinctively when danger lurked unseen. She started to anticipate his needs, offering water before he asked, gathering dried herbs for their meager meals. It was a strange, unspoken dance, two broken individuals moving in orbit around each other, seeking a fragile equilibrium in a world that had cast them both adrift. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant rain, and in the heart of that vast, indifferent wilderness, Ayanna began, ever so slowly, to stitch together the torn fragments of herself, not as the crow daughter she once was, but as something new, something forged in the crucible of loss and stark survival. The air grew heavy with a palpable tension, a foreboding that settled over them like a shroud. Kyle, typically reserved, became even more withdrawn, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his hand resting frequently on the hilt of his knife. Ayanna felt the change in him, a subtle shift in the rhythm of their solitary journey, and her own anxieties spiked. One evening, as the last sliver of sun vanished, plunging the plains into a sudden deep gloom, Kale spoke, his voice low and guttural. "We are being followed." The words hung in the oppressive silence, chilling her to the bone. She searched his face, desperate for more, for an explanation, for a plan. He offered none, only a grim set to his jaw. A long moment passed before he continued, his gaze fixed on the dying embers of their small fire. There are others. They seek what I possess. Her heart hammered against her ribs. What did he possess? Her. Was she truly nothing more than an object of exchange pursued even now by unknown entities? He finally met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something raw and exposed in his eyes. Not fear, but a deep, ingrained weariness, the burden of a hunted man. I carry a debt, he confessed, the words torn from him with visible effort. A payment owed for a life taken, a wrong unrighted. They believe I have hidden its value. The revelation hung in the air, a dark cloud revealing the true complexity of their predicament. Ayanna suddenly understood. He hadn't taken her in out of charity, or even simple transaction. He was using her as a shield, perhaps even as bait. The moral ambiguity of their bond, which she had only vaguely sensed, now solidified into a stark, unforgiving truth. He was no savior. He was a desperate man entangled in a perilous game, and she, unknowingly, had become a pawn. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, stripping away the fragile sense of security she had begun to cultivate. Her resentment, a dormant ember, flared into a hot, indignant rage. She was still being used, still a means to an end, still stripped of her autonomy. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken accusations, with the bitter taste of betrayal. She looked at the stoic profile of the man who had pulled her from one kind of despair, only to plunge her into another. The darkness of the night seemed to press in, mirroring the shadowy depths of their entwined fates. She saw now, with chilling clarity, that the wilderness was not merely the vast land around them, but the treacherous terrain of human motives, where even perceived salvation could hide a perilous trap. The memory of her parents' faces, contorted by a desperate sorrow that mirrored her own, replayed in her mind with brutal clarity. It was not a sudden, explosive confrontation, but a slow, agonizing unraveling. The whispers had started years ago, hushed conversations among the women, then the pointed glances, the pitying sighs. Her mother, usually so warm and comforting, began to look at her with an increasingly vacant gaze, as if already grieving for a future that would never come. Her father, a man of stoic strength, would retreat further into himself, the weight of their lineage pressing down on his shoulders. The final decision wasn't made in anger, but in a crucible of fear and cultural imperative. Ayanna remembered the day distinctly. The air in their teepee was heavy, thick with unshed tears, and the suffocating scent of desperation. Her mother sat opposite her, hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white. Her father stood by the entrance, his back to them, a rigid pillar of despair. "Ayanna," her mother began, her voice a fragile whisper, "the council has spoken. The ancestors, they demand continuity." Ayanna felt a cold dread seep into her bones. She already knew. She had seen it in the eyes of the other women, in the way they averted their gazes when she passed. "Our line, it must continue," her father added, his voice raspy, devoid of its usual authority. He finally turned, his face etched with a pain so profound it mirrored her own. You cannot give us the sons our people need." The words were blunt, stripped bare of euphemism, delivered like a sentence. Ayanna felt her world tilt. She was not just a woman, but a vessel, and her perceived failure to fulfill that primary role had rendered her obsolete. "They offer a strong mare," her mother continued, tears finally spilling from her eyes, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. "A young one, fertile. Her offspring, they will ensure our future." The irony was a bitter metallic taste in her mouth. She, a human being, traded for an animal, her life extinguished to spark another. Ayanna had looked from her mother's tear-streaked face to her father's haunted eyes, seeing not malice, but a terrible, desperate love, warped by cultural necessity. They were sacrificing her, not out of cruelty, but out of a profound, heartbreaking belief that their tribe's survival hinged upon it. The memory of her father's hand, reaching out, trembling, before drawing back, remained vividly etched in her mind. He couldn't touch her, couldn't embrace the daughter he was about to give away. The silence that followed was broken only by the quiet, ragged sobs of her mother, a lament for the daughter she was losing, and the future she was trying, desperately, to secure. This was the wound that festered, the primal scar that shaped her present, a constant reminder of how easily life could strip one of worth, of belonging, of everything. The revelation of Kyle's hidden burden, the specter of a past debt, and the relentless pursuit of nameless others, ripped away the fragile veneer of their uneasy peace. Ayanna felt a surge of cold fury, a raw, primal anger at being unwittingly drawn into another man's perilous game. She had been used by her parents, and now by him. The pattern felt inescapable. "You used me," she accused, her voice low, trembling with suppressed emotion. Her words, though few, carried the weight of her accumulated betrayals. Kale, usually so composed, flinched almost imperceptibly, his stoic mask cracking for a fleeting moment. He did not deny it. His silence was a confession, more potent than any spoken words. "I needed a distraction," he finally admitted, his gaze fixed on the distant, star-dusted sky, avoiding her accusing eyes. A reason for them to hesitate, to doubt. A complication. His bluntness was a fresh wound, yet there was a strange honesty in it, a lack of artifice that was almost disarming. He offered no apology, no justification, only the stark truth of his desperation. Ayanna felt tears sting her eyes, not tears of sorrow, but of frustrated rage. Her life, it seemed, was perpetually at the mercy of others' needs, others' battles. She was a tool, a bargaining chip, never truly her own. "What is it you owe?" she demanded, her voice rising now, filled with a defiant tremor. "What debt is so great it requires this?" He finally turned to face her, his eyes dark pools reflecting the dying embers. "A family," he said, his voice a low rasp, tinged with a profound grief she had not expected. "Mine. Taken. For a mistake I made. A path I chose." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken tragedy. Ayanna saw then that he, too, was broken, haunted by his own past, his own deep-seated flaws. His journey, like hers, was a flight from a crushing truth, a desperate attempt to outrun the consequences of a life irrevocably altered. A tenuous bridge, forged of shared suffering, began to form between them. They were two wounded souls, cast adrift by unforgiving circumstances, navigating a perilous world where trust was a luxury neither could afford. The land around them, once a mere backdrop, now seemed to mirror their internal struggle, vast, untamed, full of hidden dangers. The wind picked up, a mournful whisper through the grass, carrying with it the unspoken questions, the bitter resentments, and the fragile, burgeoning understanding that might, just might, bind them together in this desperate, unwanted existence. The night air grew thick with unspoken truths, the tension between Ayanna and Kyle almost a physical presence in the small, makeshift camp. The revelation of his personal tragedy, the loss of his family, had not erased her anger, but it had tempered it with a grudging, unsettling empathy. He was not just a tool then, but another victim, however flawed. "Who are they?" Ayanna pressed, her voice lower now, stripped of its initial fury, replaced by a cold fear. "Who pursues you?" Kyle was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant stars as if seeking answers there. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low murmur, barely audible above the rustle of the night wind. "They are the remnants of a splintered band, warriors I once rode with. We sought honor, but found only ruin." He paused, a deep sigh escaping his lips. "I betrayed them, not with malice but with a choice I believed was right. Choice that cost them a victory, and cost me everything." His words were a fractured glimpse into a past fraught with violence and moral complexities, a world far removed from Ayanna's Crow upbringing. He was a man steeped in conflict, shaped by hard decisions and their even harder repercussions. "They believe I took something of great value from them," Kyle continued, his voice hardening. "Something more precious than any life. It was a sacred artifact, a symbol of their power. It was lost in the chaos. They believe I concealed it or sold it." Ayanna's mind reeled. A sacred artifact. Not gold, not furs, but something intangible yet profoundly significant. This was why he was hunted. This was the true nature of his burden, and now, by extension, hers. "And you did not?" she asked, a sliver of hope, however faint, that he might yet be redeemed in her eyes. His gaze met hers, and for a fleeting moment, she saw the raw honesty that underpinned his weariness. "I tried to save it," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "From being defiled. It was lost, slipped from my grasp in the chaos. I was gravely wounded." Ayanna felt a strange shift within her. His account, though vague, rang with a painful truth. He was not a thief, perhaps, but a man burdened by a failure of monumental proportions, a man running from ghosts and the relentless pursuit of those who believed he had wronged them. The weight of his past pressed down on them both, a suffocating blanket woven from regret and danger. The air vibrated with a rising tension, the imminent threat of discovery, of confrontation. They were bound not by choice, but by the relentless forces of fate, two shattered vessels navigating a treacherous sea, with no clear harbor in sight. The first whispers of dawn painted the eastern sky with pale, ethereal hues, yet the serenity of the rising sun did little to soothe the escalating dread that pulsed between Ayanna and Kale. They had slept little, the chilling proximity of their pursuers a tangible presence in the darkness. The air was thin, charged with the brittle tension of imminent confrontation. Kale had moved with an almost frantic energy through the final hours of the night, burying their sparse possessions, erasing their tracks with painstaking care. His face was a mask of grim determination, his eyes scanning the horizon, not for beauty, but for shadows. "They are close," he stated, his voice a low growl, more to himself than to her. Too close. Ayanna's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. The wildness of the land, once a symbol of isolation, now felt like a vast, exposed stage for their impending doom. She thought of her parents, of the Crow village, a life that seemed impossibly distant, a dream from another existence. She felt the irony of her situation keenly, traded for a fertile mare, then caught in a deadly hunt for a lost artifact. Her life, so worthless to her own people, suddenly held a strange, dangerous currency for others. Kyle turned to her, his gaze intense, assessing. "You must run," he commanded, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "North. There are trading posts, far beyond this territory. You can find a way." Ayanna stared at him, bewildered. Run? Leave him? After all they had endured, all they had shared in their strange, unspoken bond, a new kind of fear, cold and sharp, pierced her. To be utterly alone, once more, adrift in an unknown world, felt almost worse than facing the danger with him. "No," she whispered, the word a defiance, a surprising strength she didn't know she possessed. Her voice was raspy, but firm. "We face this, together." Kale's eyes widened imperceptibly, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even a hint of respect, crossing his hardened features. He searched her gaze, seeking the conviction beneath her fear, and finding it, he knew she would not flee, that her spirit, though battered, was not broken. The decision was made in that shared moment of understanding. They would stand together, two unlikely allies against an encroaching darkness. The distant rumble of hooves, faint at first, then growing steadily louder, confirmed their fears. The sun, now fully risen, bathed the plains in a blinding glare, revealing the approaching figures on the horizon. A small band of riders, dark and menacing, silhouetted against the morning light. The air vibrated with the approaching storm, the inevitable clash of destinies. Ayanna took a deep breath, the taste of dust and primal fear on her tongue. Her life, stripped bare of all pretenses, was now condensed to this single, terrifying moment. The clash was swift, brutal, and utterly without mercy. The approaching riders, their faces etched with grim intent, bore down upon them with the force of a prairie fire. Kyle moved with a primal ferocity, a warrior reclaimed by instinct. His movements were a blur of coordinated power, his knife a flashing arc in the pale morning light. Ayanna, a witness to his devastating efficiency, found herself reacting, driven by a surge of adrenaline and a desperate will to survive. She saw him engage, his body a shield against the onslaught, and in that moment a profound shift occurred within her. She was no longer a discarded daughter, a burden, but a participant in her own survival. The landscape, once a vast, indifferent backdrop, now became a chaotic blur of dust, sound, and violence. The air was thick with the scent of exertion, of fear, and the metallic tang of blood. Kyle fought with a desperate intensity, a man defending not just his life but the phantom of his lost honor. He was outnumbered, but his skill was honed by years of conflict, his resolve sharpened by the ghost of his past. Ayanna, seizing a discarded branch, struck out blindly, driven by a protective instinct she hadn't known she possessed. This was not the timid crow daughter who had accepted her fate. This was a woman fighting for a nascent freedom, for the fragile breath of a new existence. In the maelstrom, a particularly brutal blow struck Kale, sending him stumbling, his breath catching in a ragged gasp. Ayanna saw it, felt the shock reverberate through her own body. He was vulnerable, and the attacking warrior lunged, spear raised. Without conscious thought, Ayanna moved. It was an impulse, a raw, protective surge, born of shared vulnerability and an undeniable, if unspoken, bond. She threw herself forward, her body acting as a desperate, clumsy shield, intercepting the blow meant for him. The pain was immediate, searing, a white-hot agony that consumed her. She cried out, more in surprise than suffering, and crumpled to the earth, the world spinning into a dizzying vortex of pain and dimming light. Kyle, enraged, let out a guttural roar, turning on her attacker with a renewed, terrifying fury. He moved with a speed that defied logic, his movements precise, deadly. The battle raged around her, a distant, muffled roar as her consciousness faded. She felt Kale's hand on her, his voice a desperate plea, but his words were indistinct, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The last thing she saw was his face, etched with a raw, agonizing fear, a reflection of the profound emotional climax that had irrevocably entwined their lives. She had given him what he could not give himself, a moment of salvation, a desperate, flawed redemption, a bridge built between two souls shipwrecked by fate. Darkness, not the comforting blanket of night, but a hollow, consuming void pressed in on Ayanna. There was no pain, only an unnerving silence, a profound detachment from her own body. Was this death? The thought was strangely calm, devoid of fear. She drifted, a leaf on an unseen current, lost in the vast echoing chambers of her consciousness. Then slowly, infinitesimally, a faint spark, a flicker of sensation began to return, a dull ache spreading like wildfire through her side. The metallic taste of blood, the rough feel of earth beneath her cheek, and then a sound, a low, ragged moan. It was Kale. He was there. Her eyes fluttered open, heavy and unwilling. The world swam into focus, blurry at first, then sharper. She was lying on the ground, a crude bandage pressed against her side. Kale knelt beside her, his face grim, his usually stoic expression etched with a profound weariness. He looked as if he had fought 100 battles. You are alive," he rasped, his voice thick with a raw emotion she had never heard from him before. He had stopped the bleeding, tended to her wound with a gentleness that contradicted the hardened lines of his face. He explained, in terse, clipped sentences, how he had fought off the remaining attackers, how he had carried her through the wilderness, seeking a safe haven. He had saved her, just as she had, in a desperate, impulsive act, saved him. The irony was palpable. The woman cast out for not being able to give life had, in turn, offered life to a man who had only known how to take it, or survive by its absence. Ayanna felt a strange mix of emotions stir within her. The anger was still there, the deep-seated wound of her abandonment, but it was now overlaid with something new, a profound sense of purpose. She had faced death, had looked into the abyss of her own insignificance, and had found a surprising, defiant will to endure. Her act of protecting Kale had not been for a cause or a tribe, but for a singular human being, for a fragile, complex connection forged in shared hardship. This was the resolution, not of her pain, but of her identity. She was not defined by her barrenness, nor by her parents' judgment. She was defined by her survival, by her capacity for self-sacrifice, by the raw, unyielding strength she had discovered within herself. The hopeful resolution was not a return to a past innocence, but a forward step into an uncertain future, carrying the scars of her journey, but also the fierce, quiet knowledge of her own worth. The sun, now high above them, felt warmer, its light infused with the promise of a new dawn, a new, tenuous beginning. The sun climbed higher, casting a gentle warmth over them, banishing the last vestiges of the night's chill. Ayanna lay still, her wound a dull throb, a constant reminder of the thin line between life and death. Kyle sat beside her, his silence no longer an oppressive burden, but a comfortable, shared space. The grimness had softened in his eyes, replaced by a quiet watchfulness, a profound gratitude. The pursuers were gone, scattered by his furious defense, their dark intentions receding into the vastness of the plains. They had survived. She had survived. The barrenness that had defined her, that had driven her from her home, now felt like a distant echo. In the crucible of violence and despair, she had found a different kind of fertility, a capacity for action, for courage, for fierce, unyielding life. She looked at Kale, truly looked at him, not as her captor nor her savior, but as another flawed human being, equally scarred, equally adrift. His life was not simple, nor was hers, but they had found a strange, precarious balance in their shared struggle. He would continue his journey, haunted by his past, seeking a peace that might forever elude him. And she, Ayanna, would also continue, not as the little willow of her childhood snapped and discarded, but as a woman forged in fire, her spirit unbowed. The plains stretched before them, vast and indifferent, yet also filled with endless possibilities. She might seek out other tribes, find a new community, or forge a solitary path. The specifics were still unwritten, a blank page waiting for the ink of her choosing. The hope that bloomed within her was not a naive optimism, but a grounded, resilient strength. It was the hope of a survivor, knowing that pain was part of the journey, but also knowing that life, in its rawest, most fundamental form, continued. Her story was not one of tragedy, but of transformation. Her parents had sold a daughter, barren and broken, but in their desperate act they had unknowingly set free a woman who carried the scars of her past, but also the fierce, quiet triumph of her present. The wind, once a mournful lament, now carried a different song, a quiet hum of resilience, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to find meaning and purpose, even in the most desolate of landscapes. She was Ayanna, and her journey, though arduous, was far from over.